Hello, Ozplat, and a big hi from Keele University in the UK, in England. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the things that have been happening in the UK around psychological literacy in general, and then thinking about the opportunities that the changes to education post-pandemic have possibly brought to help us to really engage students with psychology and with psychological literacy. So I'm going to start with a very brief introduction to psychological literacy. This symposium is all about psychological literacy, so I don't really want to dwell on this, but just to give a brief overview of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of psychological literacy. So I'm working very much from Cranney and Dunn's definition that psychological literacy is the capacity to intentionally and adaptively use psychology to achieve personal, professional and societal goals. And I'm also working from the conception that this ability to be able to apply psychology in these ways comes from the list of attributes that McGovern et al. In 2010 described when first describing psychological literacy. So some of these are about psychological subject knowledge, some are about being able to apply psychology, about ethical action, and being competent in both communicating and applying psychology in different contexts. So why is psychological literacy so important? Well, in equipping students to apply psychological skills and knowledge to their personal, professional and societal life, I believe that we enable them to really apply psychology within their own lives, which helps them to be productive, to live a meaningful life, to meet their own personal goals, and to be healthy, both psychologically and physically. I also believe that in thinking about professional life, psychological literacy means that our students are employable. And I'm working with Mance York's definition here, that employability is a set of achievements, skills, understandings and personal attributes that make graduates more likely to gain employment and be successful in their chosen occupations, which benefits themselves, the workforce, the community and the economy. I also believe that psychological literacy, in terms of applying those psychological skills and knowledge to their community and to their society, helps them to be global citizens. And I've just put some of the characteristics of a global citizen there on the slide from Oxfam. And I think all of these things are things that universities generally globally are really trying to achieve through higher education. We're all being encouraged to think about students being problem solvers who are employable, who can continue to be lifelong learners, and who can contribute to their community and society to help to make the world a better place. So I think that psychological literacy really helps to deliver the aims, the overarching aims of higher education more generically. So looking at Boyer's definition here of the aim of education, it's not only about employability and preparing students for careers, but also gives them a life of dignity and purpose, that they are not merely studying, but shaping a citizenry that can promote the public good. And then higher education from Haran in 2018, serving those three fundamental purposes: subject knowledge, disseminating and generating, creating knowledge through research and development activities, and providing service to humanity for the public good. So these are quite big questions, but I think psychological literacy maps very neatly against these different aims of higher education and, as I say, personal productivity, employability and global citizenship. Now in the UK, we're quite well developed in terms of thinking about the quality assurance of psychology in higher education, which is managed through both the QAA subject benchmark for psychology, the Quality Assurance Agency UK, which was written in 2019, and the British Psychological Society, the BPS, who's our main accrediting body. And they have a set of accreditation standards that all programmes must meet. And both of these documents explicitly mention the delivery of psychological literacy. The BPS conduct regular visits. They visit psychology departments every 5 or 6 years to check on teaching quality, curriculum, resources, and they actively encourage the teaching of psychological literacy through those visits and through that accreditation process. Now, despite the fact that in the UK psychological literacy is quite well documented and encouraged by the main agencies, it's rarely explicitly named to UK students. So this study from Harris et al. In 2021, a very recent study, showed that many students don't recognise the label of psychological literacy. If you ask them, have you learned about psychological literacy? They don't know what that is. But when you tell them about the skills and the concepts that are associated with psychological literacy, then they do begin to recognise that they have in fact learned those skills and concepts, which suggests that students are learning the skills and knowledge associated with psychological literacy, but not learning the name of it. So it's integrated into their courses, but it's not necessarily labelled as such. Meanwhile, a variety of studies has shown that psychological literacy is difficult to measure, and when you do try and measure it, it doesn't necessarily follow patterns that you might expect. So as students progress through a psychology degree, they don't necessarily develop their psychological literacy in the way that we might expect when they're studying psychology. And students of different disciplines also seem to actually pick up some of the concepts of psychological literacy. And Sam Newell from Adelaide University has shown in a couple of different studies that the way that we conceptualise psychological literacy in the literature isn't really that consistent either, that people are focusing on different aspects. So, for example, Murdoch is really focusing on ethics, whereas perhaps the work that I've published has been really more thinking about these global citizenship and employability aspects, the ability to apply psychology to problem solving in everyday and community life. So psychological literacy can be critiqued because it doesn't seem to be something very concrete. And Steve Newstead in 2015 wrote a paper suggesting that psychological literacy is aspirational at best, so that not all psychology graduates will possess psychological literacy. And Murdoch also suggested that psychological literacy was still under construction. It hadn't been adequately defined yet, and that it might be a goal of psychology education, but it wasn't the goal. So in response to those criticisms, I've argued previously, along with Hulme Cranney in 2021, a book chapter that's in press at the moment, that psychology graduates all have the opportunity to achieve psychological literacy. They can gain all those skills and knowledge, but they tend to do so to different extents. So they might be really good at the scientific literacy aspects of psychological literacy, for example, but not so good at the problem solving, or vice versa. And as Murdoch comments, not all the skills contained within psychological literacy are only specific to psychology. So it's quite possible that students in other disciplines will demonstrate some of those attributes, such as communication skills, for example, or ethics. And so what I think is that we're seeing that psychological literacy is being delivered in a way that is running through a curriculum. It's integrated within the psychological curriculum rather than being bolted on and really shouted about. And actually we know that that's consistent with the literature on how we teach skills in general. Students are much likely to assimilate those skills and to acquire those skills if they're part of their subject curriculum rather than taught separately. So what helps students to develop psychological literacy through psychology education? Well, I've previously argued, again, partly in a paper of my own and one in this chapter with Jackie, that psychological literacy is best delivered by psychologically literate educators. If teachers aren't psychologically literate themselves, it's very difficult for them to deliver psychological literacy to their students. We've argued that curricula need to be planned at programme level in order to achieve psychological literacy, so that it can be scaffolded throughout the programme. I've also suggested that curricula need to be constructively aligned. So the learning outcomes, the learning activities and the assessment need to match so students know what they're going to learn, practice what they're learning, get formative assessment, formative feedback on that, and then are assessed on it to demonstrate that they have those skills. Also authentic assessment that is similar to assessment to activities and problem solving that students as graduates will need to complete in their employment situations or in their societal lives, and also to integrate work integrated learning opportunities like placements. And I'll come back to that in a second. Before the pandemic in the UK, most psychology teaching was taught in a very traditional way, so lectures, lab classes and seminars. And the focus of psychology education was very much on theory and content. And my feeling is that that's not particularly well aligned to developing psychological literacy, where we're asking students to demonstrate problem solving and application skills in terms of their psychology skills and knowledge. Since the pandemic, first of all, there was a move in the UK to emergency remote teaching, where all teaching was online. But as we move into the sort of current times, as the pandemic is easing, there's a sort of move towards blended learning, and many universities are recommending that we use online learning alongside face-to-face teaching. And the principle of that is that the face-to-face teaching should be very much more interactive, about active learning, peer learning and support from the tutor, rather than sitting and listening to a lecture. And I've linked there from the slides a couple of different principles that you might find interesting that illustrate this, including the Kiel principles from my own university. As well as changing to blending learning and making those face-to-face sessions more interactive, exams have been very much replaced by coursework in most universities. The idea of sitting students in a room for 2 hours to write as fast as they can and possibly increase COVID transmission risk has been seen as not a good idea for obvious reasons. And so people have been trying to replace exams with coursework. And the idea is that using authentic assessment of these everyday life employability situations is a way to increase skills development and motivate that in students, but also to reduce academic misconduct, because it's much harder to plagiarise such a piece of coursework. Again, I'm linking here to the Kiel assessment principles from my own university and some resources by Sally Brown and Kay Samble over in the UK. So how does this help? Well, in terms of constructive alignment, blended learning really does provide the perfect opportunity for the integration of psychological literacy into the course. So, for example, you might have a learning outcome which talks about students who complete the course being able to apply psychological knowledge to understand and solve problems in a local community. You might then have asynchronous learning sessions, so pre-recorded or readings that are provided online, perhaps on a virtual learning environment, where you might, for example, introduce social psychological theory. The in-class session, the face-to-face session, would involve the students working in groups to apply theory to authentic problems and getting some formative feedback. So really having that opportunity to practice the skills and using the knowledge in a very applied way. And then after the session, an asynchronous activity again, where perhaps they work independently on a case study, maybe write up a short report on their thoughts and their findings. So really kind of building in this idea of knowing what they're going to learn and then having opportunities to practice both in groups and independently to develop those skills. And then following that up with an authentic assessment. And I apologise for the size of the font on this slide. I've taken this from Sally Brown and Kay Samble's resource. And it's an example that I've provided for them to illustrate how authentic assessment might work in psychology. So we start with a traditional exam question, which might be discuss the ways in which intergroup conflict can arise and be reduced within a community using social psychological theories. And that's the way we might previously have assessed this sort of module, this sort of course. And then instead, I've proposed an authentic assessment where students get a little vignette, a little case study that talks about a new housing development, which is social housing, where residents are diverse, and there's just the beginnings of tension among the community between two groups, the younger group and the older group. And then I've shown how students might structure their assessment response in response to this case study. So really getting them to think about what does this psychology mean in the real world, within the community, within society, rather than can I write descriptively about a lot of different theories. And so I think what we're seeing in the UK at the moment is that the post-pandemic moves in the UK towards more blended learning is actually going to provide more opportunity to deliver psychological literacy. So I think we're going to see more opportunities for practical learning and a more genuine psychological literacy rather than talking about psychological literacy. And authentic assessment will really help to close the loop in terms of constructive alignment. However, I still think there's a bit of an issue because psychology academic staff have often been taught in very traditional ways and they haven't really developed their own psychological literacy yet. And so there's a real need for continuing professional development and resources to support them to take that forwards and to integrate it into their teaching. At the same time, there's another challenge around work integrated learning and placements because they have become quite challenging during the pandemic because workplaces haven't been able to open up their doors to psychology students. It has been possible in some cases in the UK in terms of online placements, but we really need to explore some different models of work integrated learning to facilitate this further. And I'd suggest looking at Reddy et al.'s Psychology Department Employability Guide, which is linked from the slide there, and I'm happy to send anybody the slides that wants them, where there's lots of case studies for how employability can be delivered within psychology degrees. We also need to really think about planning our curricula from start to finish, and I think this is where there hasn't been a massive take-up across the UK, although it is growing, so that psychological literacy is at the heart of programmes. Whether or not we make it explicit to students, it needs to be written into the programme from start to finish and really scaffolded from the first year through to the final year. And so I'd like to leave you with some questions. Does this sound similar to what's happening in other nations? Are there particular practical steps that we can take in order to really capitalise on these new opportunities? And where do you think we can go with this next? How can we capitalise on the opportunities that we have to really develop psychological literacy in our higher education psychology programmes? Thank you ever so much, and please do feel free to drop me a line on j.a.hume@keele.ac.uk or to message me on Twitter. I'm at JulieH_psych, PSYC, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. I'm sorry I can't be with you tonight. Unfortunately, I have COVID, but I hope you have a great conference. Thanks. Bye.